episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show with another fascinating guest who is helping to create a better tomorrow for so many people. We have the honor today of being joined by Dr. LaToya Myles, who is the director of the Atmospheric Turbulence and Diffusion Division, ATDD, of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Air Resources Laboratory. She is the first woman and the first African-American person to hold this position in the office's 73-year history. And as a little background, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, is an American scientific agency within the United States Department of Commerce that focuses on the conditions of the oceans, waterways, and the atmosphere. Dr. Myles earned her Ph.D. through NOAA's Environmental Cooperative Science Center, now the Center for Coastal and Marine Ecosystems, at Florida A&M University in Tallahassee, Florida. She conducted research in collaboration with the NOAA Air Resources Laboratory for an interdisciplinary dissertation, where she focused on atmospheric deposition of pollutants and their impact on ecosystems. And her study has had broad implications for both human and environmental health. Dr. Myles has been recognized for her academic achievements with many scholarships, fellowships, and awards, including NOAA's Educational Partnership Program with Minority Serving Institution Graduate Sciences Program Fellowship, and the EPA Science to Achieve Results Star Fellowship. She was recognized as 2016 Technology All-Star at the 21st Women of Color STEM Conference. She's also a member of the American Geophysical Union and Earth Science Women's Network. Upon completion of her dissertation, Dr. Myles became a physical scientist at the NOAA ATDD. She was in this role for several years before being promoted to supervisory physical scientist for 12 years, and then she took on the role of director this year in February. Dr. Myles' research is interdisciplinary, involving both atmospheric chemistry and environmental sciences, measuring the exchange of gases and particles between the air and land and coastal and agricultural ecosystems. And the data she collects from these studies is used to improve estimates of air pollution, provide information about the potential impact on both human health and the environment. Dr. LaToya Myles, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Absolutely happy to be here.
Well, it's great that you're here. I typically love to start off by handing our guests the floor just for a little bit. If you could take us a little more into your story from the beginning, everything from where you grew up to how you developed your initial interest in chemistry and biology and environmental sciences, and a little bit more on your career journey to date. I think that'd be a great way to start off.
Absolutely. I was born and raised in Mississippi, and my parents are both educators. So it was always natural for me to be around schools, be around following my mom in her classroom, and my dad worked in our central office for the district schools for our county and following him around on his job. So I've always had education as a big part of my life growing up. And as I got to middle school, it was then called junior high, and high school, I had some amazing science teachers who were dedicated to their craft, but also who made science interesting. And that's something I've come away with over the years, is so many kids, when they're taking different subjects in school, particularly science, if it's not interesting, if it's not exciting, unfortunately, they get turned off to that subject. For me, I had wonderful teachers in biology and chemistry and earth sciences that made it exciting and fun. And that was a spark for me to learn more about science. And then also during the summers in high school, I participated in various internships, some in engineering, some in acoustics. One of the things I learned from those various experiences is that sometimes you learn what you don't want to do. I had wonderful mentors and individuals that worked with me and mentored me in those different summer internships. But afterwards, I learned maybe that's not the particular discipline for me. And I kind of found my way into chemistry because initially going into undergraduate, I thought I wanted to pursue the medical profession and become an MD. But then as I started learning more about chemistry and about biology as well, I realized that I had a passion more for the research side of things, for asking those why questions, those how questions versus being a practitioner. And so that led me to double major in undergraduate at Alcorn State University in Mississippi in chemistry and biology. And I had some wonderful summer experiences there as well that helped me learn about what was going on in the environment and how I, as a scientist, could learn more about it and maybe help solve some of the issues that we're facing environmentally. And that continued on in my graduate work at Florida A&M University. And it just took a direction to where I stopped looking overall at the environment and really focused on the atmospheric environment and the air that we breathe. And it's something that came naturally to me. I think we see the ocean so we can understand about plastics pollution in the ocean. We see the soil so we can understand about soil degradation and things that happen. But it's much more difficult sometimes for us to picture what happens in the air because in many cases we don't see the level of pollution that's in the air. And so part of my mission is to help people understand what a healthy atmosphere looks like and to understand how we as a global community, as well as a nation, can make small changes to help improve the quality of the air that we breathe.
Outstanding. And, you know, along those lines, several months ago, I had the opportunity to talk to Frank Marks in the hurricane division of NOAA, and obviously his purview sort of, you know, ends at the coasts and obviously the ocean. Your purview is a little broader because you were just saying it's obviously everything of not just the United States atmosphere, but atmosphere is always coming in to the country and leaving. And so your purview is kind of broad. Could you just talk a little bit, introduce us a little to ATDD, Atmospheric Turbulence and Diffusion Division of NOAA, and a little bit too about sort of, I sit here in Center City, Philadelphia, and I do see some smokestacks and factories in the distance. Where does sort of ATDD's responsibility sort of end versus something like EPA when I think of sort of particulate matter going into the sky?
Sure, absolutely. Our Atmospheric Turbulence and Diffusion Division, or ATDD, has been around since 1948. So we've been involved in looking at atmospheric issues for many, many decades. And as you'll see in our name, turbulence and diffusion was kind of why our lab was founded. So turbulence is how the air moves and what moves in the air. I think sometimes people tend to think of winds as straight line winds, the air moves, but within those straight line winds, they're called eddies. They're these small motions. When I speak to schools and speak with students, I kind of remind them, if you've ever seen a dust devil in a parking lot or in a field, that's the way the air moves all the time. There's this circular rotating motion. And what we study at ATD is trying to understand the physics and the chemistry of that motion. What are some of the drivers of that motion? And as for the chemistry prospect, we're trying to understand what are the gases and the particles that are being picked up from smokestacks, from other areas, from car traffic, how that travels through the atmosphere, and ultimately where it ends up. One thing your audience may be interested in really thinking about is we may have country borders, we may have state borders, but the air doesn't respect those borders. It moves across. So one of the key research questions we have is what happens to those chemical compounds as they're moving through the air? What happens in the physics of the atmosphere that influences when we see severe weather events, when we see events of high air pollution? So we're really on the front end and the cutting edge of research and trying to understand some of those questions. Another big aspect of our work is dealing with trying to understand and measure some of the variables related to long-term changes. So not just changes that happen on the weather scale, but also changes that happen over many, many decades on the climate scale. One of our premier monitoring programs that we have is the U.S. Climate Reference Network, where we have stations that are measuring things like precipitation and air temperature and other variables in all 50 states. And we currently have over 20 sites in Alaska as well that are measuring these variables so that we as a scientific community can have data over how things are changing, not just this week or this year, but over decades of time, hopefully.
Along those lines, I saw you you quoted in a NOAA article, and you quote, "For most of us, breathing is an unconscious action. We don't think about what's in the air we breathe. Figuring it out is your job." Take us, if you would, a little bit on. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff that's in the air that we, as you mentioned, we don't see. But what are some of the areas that you focus on, specifically as we talk a lot about health and wellness, not just of humans, but our animals that we, whether our pets or our production animals and so forth. What are some of the different categories and topics that you're most concerned / interested in when it comes to actually figuring out what we're all breathing?
Absolutely. So the chemical species that I've spent a lot of time studying is ammonia. The chemical symbol for that is NH3. People tend to think of the cleaning solution, but the ammonia that we're looking at is ammonia that gets emitted mainly from agriculture, somewhat from transportation. And it's a gas, invisible gas in the atmosphere. That ammonia gets emitted, for example, from fertilized fields, from concentrated animal feeding operations, and other areas where you have a lot of waste from production animals. It gets emitted into the air, and I'm trying to understand, how does it travel through the air? And while it's in the air, it's not a static gas. It can react with other gases and particles to form different types of chemical compounds that we need to understand. So I've spent a lot of time studying ammonia because it's actually one of the more difficult species to try to understand atmospherically. One, it gets emitted from these really large sources. We have a lot of agriculture in the US. It gets emitted from these really large sources. And depending on conditions, rainfall and air temperature and humidity, ammonia can sometimes stay in the atmosphere for a day or two and then eventually deposit back to land in that certain region, or it can combine with other gases and end up as particulate matter, which is something we're very concerned about from a health aspect, particularly the smaller scale particulate matter. And that can affect people's health and respiratory systems in places that are even far away from agriculture. So we've conducted a series of measurements in different agricultural ecosystems to try to understand what those dynamics are and to collect data over the long term so that we can see what the trends are.
And continuing along that, obviously, the general public, in terms of thinking about these gases, the predominant one in recent years, of course, that has occupied all our minds is carbon dioxide. You spent a lot of time with what is equally extremely important, ammonia, very important in, obviously, not just the effects it has on us, but if there was no nitrogen and so forth, a lot of other important things of the earth don't happen. Talk a little bit about some of just the issues that you also think about, putting humans aside, and in terms of the environment and ammonia and sort of this biogeochemical cycle that you study a lot.
Sure, absolutely. Well, as I mentioned, ammonia can travel. It can deposit regionally near the source where it was emitted, or it can travel for days or weeks in the atmosphere and have an effect somewhere else. Well, some of those effects happen in that biogeochemical cycling. What we've noticed is that ammonia can be deposited to plants and to soils, and it can actually change the chemistry that's happening in the upper levels of the soils, that soil chemistry, as well as what's happening within the leaf of a plant. We've done several studies in collaboration with colleagues from EPA and USDA and some of our academic colleagues to try to understand what those issues are. So we've decided to take this really interdisciplinary approach. Not only are we measuring ammonia and other nitrogen species in the atmosphere, we're also measuring it in soil samples as well as plant samples, so we can understand what deposits to the surface and then how it potentially can be incorporated by soil microbes or within the plant itself and affect the chemistry of the plant in the soil. And there are some studies from Europe that show that if you have sufficient amounts of nitrogen that's being deposited to fields, it's an enriching aspect. It's almost like a fertilizer for some plants. So where you can see this really wild amount of plant growth, but then also there's this certain limit that you can reach where it's detrimental to plant growth. And so there's a lot of aspects of this that not only deal with atmospheric science, but also with agricultural science and ecosystem science. And so it's a very broad biogeochemical cycle. And what I look at it is we're taking a small piece of that in order to focus on from an atmospheric deposition point of view.
Outstanding. In addition to your work on sort of the environmental issues, the human health issues, your work also has some very interesting national security implications. And I was reading recently a fascinating piece about a a grant, or actually it was a research, a postdoc program that you were involved in. It was the intelligence community's postdoc research fellowship program. It was specifically a research that was predicting sort of what happens with hazardous materials that may get dispersed via some process, terrorism, or whatever in an urban environment. Obviously, nothing confidential here, but can you talk a little bit about some of the things you think about in terms of national security when you think of your scientific capabilities there?
Absolutely. So one of the things is I may have been studying ammonia, but the physical processes, the winds, the precipitation, the humidity that affects how ammonia travels through the atmosphere is the same, whether that chemical compound is ammonia or something that's much more hazardous and dangerous to the population. So having that kind of foundational understanding of what those physical processes are, we were easily able to transition to look at some of the questions, research questions that are related to the intelligence community. And I've been really lucky enough to have a wonderful postdoctoral researcher on board with me, Nabila Lishiheb, who's been focused on this issue, taking what we've learned from our ammonia work and then transitioning that over to try to understand what are some of the physical processes that can determine if there's something that's dispersed in an urban area in a city, how that can travel through the air, where that can potentially land. And so we've had some really interesting modeling results that she's using the high split model, which was developed by our laboratory, the Air Resources Laboratory, in order to try to understand some of the fate of some of those potentially hazardous compounds. And we've had a great partnership with the intelligence community in order to advance that work.
Wonderful, wonderful. Dr. Myles, I'd love to get your a couple minutes of your thoughts on, I don't know what the right term for this is, but sort of the some of the environmental engineering concepts that folks like the Bill Gateses of the world have on the drawing board in regard to climate change. We hear about these concepts in sort of the popular press of, seeding the atmosphere with metals or whatever to either capture carbon dioxide or block a certain amount of sunlight or whatever. I'm talking out of my sphere here, but can you just give us a couple of minutes on your thoughts of some of these grand sort of geoengineering concepts as it pertains to your domain of the atmosphere?
I think it's really interesting. There's some really interesting proposals out there about what could work. And what I understand, again, it's not my area of expertise, but from what I understand, there's really some interesting research questions that are associated with how we understand geoengineering, what that means in different regions of the world. Could anything like that even be applied to where it would be useful for us to be able to conduct some kind of research in that area? And I think a lot of that is really preliminary at this stage. From what I've read, is mostly like you and maybe like your audience in the popular press, is that there are really a lot of ideas and theories at this point. So I'm not exactly sure about how far this has gone into trying to develop more concrete methods, scientific methods, so we can test different applications of these theories.
So interesting when someone talks about putting something up in the atmosphere that can go everywhere. But I'm glad you're looking at it as well. So, so aside from the environment and the human health and obviously national security, when you're not doing all of that, you're very active on the STEM front. I've seen a lot of things about you sort of lecturing students and other organizations in terms of STEM and sort of the importance of getting into these fields for the future. Talk a little bit about your work extracurricular to NOAA in generating excitement and interest in STEM in the next generation.
Yeah, as I mentioned, education has always been a big part of my life, particularly K through 12 education. So when I, before the pandemic, when I could actually go physically into schools and speak to students, that was one of the favorite parts of my job, is to be able to share the science that NOAA is doing with students, not only here in Tennessee, but in other states as well, because I think it's important for the next generation to see diverse individuals who are serving in various roles as scientists, as engineers, as mathematicians, so that they can understand what's possible. I also believe in supporting the next generation of scientists, because you and I won't be around for the next 100 years, right? Unless we have some great scientific breakthrough when it comes to that. And so I want to ensure that the important work of understanding the environment is left in good hands, that we're training the next generation of individuals who can take over this work and be able to make even more advancements in scientific discoveries that at this point we probably haven't even thought of yet. And those individuals right now are in our elementary, middle, and high schools. And so I feel like it's part of my mission to help support their work. The second aspect of that is I also am a strong believer in mentoring. Mm-hmm. I've mentored several students over the years, both at the high school, undergraduate, and graduate level, because I think when you're in a college setting and you're in classes, it's a very different collegial atmosphere or professional atmosphere from being in a workplace as a scientist. And so I give them the opportunity to be able to see what the day in the life of a scientist looks like in NOAA, and to understand that while we are focused on advancing the science, there's so many other pieces that support the projects that we're doing. As a scientist, we have to be able to clearly communicate the work that we're doing and the results that we have, whether that's in writing or in giving seminars or speeches or doing podcasts. We also have to be able to understand how we're collaborating with others. It's a lot about building partnerships, whether that's with others in the university setting, with federal agencies, state agencies, and other stakeholders, because for many of the environmental issues that we're focused on, we have people in the community that have concerns. And so as a scientist, we need to be able to leverage the data that we're collecting and the models that we're developing to be able to help our communities answer some of those really key questions.
And along those lines, as mentioned in your bio, you're not just the first woman that has held this position. You're the first African-American to ever hold this very important position. Could you say a few words about the Educational Partnership Program with minority serving institutions?
Without the Educational Partnership Program, I would have never heard of NOAA. Honestly, as a K-12 student and as an undergraduate scientist who was interested in working in the environment, my first mind went to EPA. That's kind of the standard, I think, for most individuals. But when I was a graduate student, my advisor, Dr. Larry Robinson, encouraged me to apply for a fellowship from the Educational Partnership Program. And I was lucky enough to receive that fellowship, and it introduced a whole new world for me. Frankly, before applying for that fellowship and developing my application, I had never heard of NOAA, and I didn't understand the breadth and the depth of the work that NOAA does. And so in researching to develop that application, and as an early fellow during those days, when I came to understand that NOAA has offices in all 50 states, weather forecast offices, that we're researching the ocean, we're researching through satellites, we're researching through observations on the ground and in aircraft. We're developing models using high performance computing. It was really just opened up a whole new world for me as a scientist. And so without that fellowship, I would not be in this position today that I hold with the agency.
Wonderful. Final point. At the very beginning, Dr. Myles, you mentioned your mother and father and the important influence of them in your life. At this point of the show, I'd love to take the opportunity just to hand you back the floor again. You mentioned obviously you've been involved in mentoring a lot, but important mentors, influencers in your life other than your parents that you might want to mention, shout out to at this point. Please take the floor with that one.
Absolutely. I have so many individuals that have been instrumental at different parts of my educational and professional career, and they're not always scientists. You know, some of them are the staff that work in the universities. There are staff that were in the School of the Environment, at that time, the Environmental Sciences Institute at FAMU, that were critical to assisting not only me, but all of the graduate students in ensuring that we were able to have space to do our work and to have study groups. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the staff and the departments, both at Florida A&M University as well as at Alcorn State University. And then in addition, there were three gentlemen who at different points in my career put me on track in order to achieve at the next level. And I'd say that first person is Dr. Troy Stewart, who was a chemistry professor at Alcorn State University. He was the individual who recognized within me that I had the ability to be a double major, not to only focus on biology, but also to focus on chemistry. I also would be remiss if I didn't thank Dr. Joseph Russell, who was the chair of the chemistry department at Alcorn State University. He was the individual who said, if you're interested in graduate school, I know someone at Florida A&M University, and I think this would be a wonderful opportunity. So I would not have been able to transition and be successful in that next step of graduate school without Dr. Russell recognizing that in me and encouraging that interest in me. And then, of course, my dissertation advisor, and I call him my forever mentor, is Dr. Larry Robinson, who was the head of that institute at the time and is currently serving as the president at Florida A&M University. Dr. Robinson was instrumental in introducing me to just how broad environmental sciences is, and to helping me understand that within that field, I could have a real impact through the observations I could make, the data I could collect, and then how I could publish and share that data in a meaningful way with communities, not only in this country, but across the world. So without those individuals and a host of others, I don't think I would be in this position today.
Wonderful message. Wonderful message. Dr. Myles, it's been a fascinating time listening to your story, everything you've done, everything you're going to be continuing to do, and really very inspiring, and wishing you the best with all of it. For everybody that's going to be listening to this particular episode on the podcast or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to Dr. LaToya Myles, Director of the Atmospheric Turbulence and Diffusion Division at the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration Air Resources Laboratory, doing amazing things, not just on the planetary health front, but the human and animal health front for national security. Dr. Myles, it was a real pleasure talking to you, hearing about your journey. And as we like to say on the show, thank you, not just for joining the show, but thank you for helping to create a better tomorrow via everything that you're doing. It was a real honor talking to you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.